Okay, so we're now recording. Meeting is officially kicking off. And hello, I guess this is our third Kubernetes SIG meeting. It's been a little bit chaotic getting it started, so I apologize for any mishaps that we had with the last meeting and getting the video out there. This week's pretty interesting for us. We've got a lot going on. Specifically, a lot of the people that typically participate are in Barcelona right now. So we have quite a few people at KubeCon. KubeCon's a pretty exciting event for everybody. Didn't get a lot of agenda items, but let's go ahead and just jump in. Typically what we do is we start off with a quick hello and who's here. I can start. My name is Kevin Bridges. I'm the CTO at a company called Drud Technology. We do a lot of Kubernetes work. We are in the process of launching a hosting platform specifically on Kubernetes and have a high amount of interest in solving a lot of the problems that people that deploy Drupal specifically encounter with Kubernetes or PHP applications in general. Let's just go through the room real quick. Matt, I guess you're next up on the screen.
Sure. So I spent a lot of time in the Drupal community for many years and have been deep in the Kubernetes world for a couple of years now. These days I work for Microsoft working on AKS, a managed Kubernetes offering, and just kind of saw that this was happening today and thought I'd come say hello to old friends and see how Drupal on Kube is coming along.
Cool. Florian?
Yeah, so my name is Florian Larton. Also see a couple of familiar faces here. Been in the Drupal community for a while too. I'm currently CTO for Wunder, a Drupal agency, or I guess Drupal agency. We do a lot more other things nowadays, so we're also we're not launching a hosting product. We do hosting for our own clients so we have a mixture of Drupal and non-Drupal stuff. Also quite interested in that whole Kubernetes space. We have some stuff going on, but not in production yet.
Great. Siva?
Yeah, hi everyone. I have been in Drupal community for the past 12 years, and I am currently working with FraternityOps.com. We are planning to launch a product, a platform as a service for PHP products, especially Drupal, because I have a lot of Drupal experience. So probably we are starting with that, and I'm a product owner of that product.
Great.
And it obviously uses Kubernetes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Sean, I think you're up next.
I'm Sean Stratton. I actually work with Kevin at Drud, and I've been part of the PHP community, not the Drupal community specifically, since 2003. So I work primarily on infrastructure, and I'm just here to kind of listen in and see, what implications there are to the way the infrastructure and the actual objects themselves work. And it's more of a curiosity than a professional capacity.
Great. Okay. Well, one of the things that we kind of are identifying as we have some of these meetings, or one of the real reasons that we wanted to start talking about this, was that there are specific problems in the PHP space and Drupal that don't play well with Kubernetes. The ones that we've been able to identify as being very problematic right out of the gate are things like object file storage. There's a host of issues that I think Brad Jones surfaced that are directly related to that. We have, some targeted efforts that we can kind of engage on to help people out, or maybe collaboratively help solve these problems for each other. So that's definitely been one of the things that we've been talking about. I put a link to our meeting minutes and agenda. I'll put it into the Zoom so that it gets caught there for anybody that watches the video afterwards. But if you could take a look at that and maybe look through some of the Drupal issues and some of the past minutes, it might help you get caught up to speed with where we are on those conversations. So for me, that's really kind of an interest point. I don't really quite know how to run this particular meeting because of the smaller attendance, but maybe if we could just take a few minutes and go around and talk about some of the areas that we're currently focusing on, or some of the problem spaces that we're currently having in Kubernetes. and see if there's anything that comes out of the conversation. I can go ahead and start. The area that we're, I think, the most interested in right now is really understanding RBAC and user controls as it applies to API interaction with Kubernetes, tying that together with things like Firebase or having a centralized user management system integrating at the same level as native Kube interactions. That's huge for us right now. We're spending a lot of time focusing there and getting that to work. Spending a lot of time understanding what different authentication layers mean to Kubernetes and how to get them to all play together properly. It's been a bit of a challenge for us. We started going down the Kubernetes route. I think, like a lot of people do, we were very ignorant at what we were doing, and I'm the first person to admit that. We started by writing a lot of APIs and a lot of wrappers to encapsulate the way that we thought that things should be done in Kubernetes, and eventually came to the realization that, as you get deeper and deeper, the more native you can go with the Kube APIs, the more you can operate natively with CRDs and operators and, following those well-established patterns, the better off you're going to be. So eventually we've had to reinvent ourselves a couple of times to make sure that we're staying in alignment with that. So there's my interest right now. Maybe go around the room and share war stories. I don't know. How about you, Matt? You got anything to add to that?
Oh, I mean, that's a really good intro. I'm very curious, like exactly what part of the authentication authorization you're interested in. I mean, I'm assuming you're running or you're wanting to go multi-tenant on top of Kube, and then what expose Kube API to end users.
Yes.
Yeah.
Through maybe a CLI, for example, so that they're basically using declarative implementations to be able to define their state natively, so that we essentially get out of their way. And then we have the ability to expose specific parts of that CRD to them to be able to interact with, so that they're not, having complete access to the Kube API. So I think what we've done, and I didn't do this, so forgive me if I missed the details correctly, is we stood up another API server to kind of abstract away the pieces that we don't want the customers to have access to, and then expose that version of the Kube API to them so that they have a limited sandbox that they can engage in.
Nifty, that's cool. And was that just because you couldn't, that RBAC didn't provide enough flexibility to just directly use RBAC?
It's because we wanted to make sure that we could track a user across different products and across different systems, so that we could provide a universal way for them to authenticate. And we've completely separated out authentication and authorization. So they can authenticate, be associated with any number of things that we do, in addition to having proper RBAC controls inside of Kubernetes and accounts provision for them and organization management and everything else that goes with that.
Gotcha. That's really cool.
Cool. Florian, did you have anything that you wanted to share or talk about?
Well, I guess it's pretty interesting because we're actually coming from a very different angle. We are like we're working in a setup that's really made to work within an organization, pretty much assuming that you can trust everyone. So like very permissive set of tools where we just want our developers to be able to do stuff. And yes, we will need to figure out billing. We definitely should have something that's secure, but the main goal is to have pretty much a cluster where we can just have developers just do stuff and just create a repository, push their code, and then the CI just takes care of deploying everything. And we actually have something that works quite well for that. But yeah, the completely different set of issues. For example, we've seen that many of the, like when it comes to that object storage or file storage for Drupal file uploads, most of the solutions that actually work, they rely on something outside of the cluster. And that makes it difficult to provision. And for us, we actually we want to provision a new environment for every single branch that gets pushed. And if you need to wait 5 minutes, then your Helm deployment will have a timeout. Everything needs to wait, and that doesn't actually work. So for these kind of reasons, we actually really want to have something that, well, it doesn't necessarily need to be in the cluster, but we need to be able to have a reliable way of just quickly provisioning things on demand. And yeah, many of the solutions that we've seen that actually work, either they're too slow or they're really expensive. Because if you want to have like, hey, you have 20 developers on a project, so between open pull requests and things like that, you're going to have 30 environments. If each of those costs like 10 euros a month, suddenly it just gets too big for what it is, especially if you have more of these projects in parallel. So this is the kind of like this convenience aspect that is really, really key for us. But yeah, also we see that we have exactly those same kind of issues with file upload, which is like, it's stupid because it's such a negligible part of the project. But at the same time, it's really the one that's causing a lot of issues. And we're following a few different options at the moment. So there's some new development in Rook regarding NFS support that seems like it could eventually be an interesting one. Also, yeah, as I mentioned well, it was mentioned in the agenda from last time. Also trying out a few things with rclone rclone and fly system. So it seems like all of these solutions kind of require some kind of compromise. And that's also one thing that we see. We are totally fine with having a very opinionated setup. So for example, the whole challenges that were mentioned regarding installing Drupal and needing like these kind of like Drupal having access to the files and so on, we don't really care about that. The way that we deploy code, it's pretty much, well, the entire code base will be part of the image, and like if we need to modify anything, it's going to be done as part of development process. It's never going to be done in the deployed environment.
Gotcha. Yeah, file management is becoming a pretty big deal in the Drupal space. And I linked a couple of issues that have been surfaced earlier that might be worth considering some type of a collective effort to focus on. I think that if we can get into a working flow, I'm willing to dedicate resources to Drupal issues to be able to solve those issues to help move everybody forward. And I think that sentiment is shared across the community. But I know we've hit our fun issues with file syncing and database management too. So curious to see where all this goes. Siva, do you have any top of mind things with Kubernetes or anything you'd like to maybe throw out there?
Yeah, I'm completely new to Kubernetes, so I didn't get much to interact with it. So we are indirectly using Kubernetes through Rancher API. So we have a Rancher pipeline setup, and it is integrated with GitLab, and obviously Rancher has this multi-tenancy. So it does most of our work, like multi-tenancy, the pipeline, the triggering, and everything. So right now we are concentrating on building a billing and metering section where we could, any client who runs an application, we could just break down the entire costing into invoice saying that this much you have consumed. You have consumed AWS resources. You have consumed some of our hosted resources like the Docker registry and the bandwidth and stuff. So right now we are concentrating on that. And next plan of action for us in our product is to have a setup to run the Rundeck platform. I hope most of the people are aware of Rundeck. Yeah. So Rundeck is a platform where it's an open source product where you just upload your scripts, maybe Python, shell scripts or anything, and it exposes those scripts as API. And Rundeck also has its own multi-tenancy. So we'll be using the Rundeck platform to trigger off database backups, database syncs, database management through that API. And probably in our dashboard, we'll allow a lot of actions so that users can run arbitrary scripts on their containers. So that is the plan of action, and we are just in 3 weeks of development, so nothing much to expect from us.
Well, hopefully this group can help you get over the learning curve a little bit and get some additional velocity there. I know in 3 weeks you can get a lot done, but you're just barely scraping the surface, I would imagine.
Yes.
Cool. And Sean, how about you? Do you have any Kubernetes issues top of mind or anything that you'd like to maybe throw out to the group?
I mean, from my perspective, and I take a more infrastructure-based approach, obviously, the main things that come to mind are managing attached resources, that's your database, your object storage, your attached file storage, etc. But it's also managing configuration and ensuring that there's a consistent layer between how we configure things in Kubernetes versus how we configure things in PHP. That's one of the concerns I still have. I realize that there are several different approaches to it. I just don't know if there's a formalized one, and I'd kind of like to find that out. And then finally, it's also to ensure that we're not drawing in layers that we don't need to. So if we look at the standard stack, you're looking at an ingress resource, and then in some cases that's Nginx, in some cases it's not. But then you still have to feed through a web server, which has to feed through an FPM server, and you still have to host your static resources as well. So I'm kind of concerned about just how complex that infrastructure can become, and how do we keep it minimized while still maintaining full functionality of the core site. So those are the kind of the issues I'm looking to hopefully answer as part of this group over time. Obviously, Florian already talked about managing attached resources, and I mean there is some movement in the Kubernetes community overall. There's obviously a service catalog. There are a few open source projects that do things like deploy databases and so forth, and I understand that the wait time for that is kind of painful at times. However, that's usually not the software itself as much as it is the provider that's creating those resources. So that's really kind of the questions I'd like to answer and approach, and those are I think going to be the major problems of as a group we have to tackle over the next couple of cycles.
Cool. And Ellie, did you have anything to add for the group?
Not particularly. I'm mostly eavesdropping and taking notes. Sorry about the echo.
Yeah. So it seems, Sean, have you had any exposure to Helm?
I've had significant exposure to Helm, and that's a sticky subject because everybody has a different opinion about Helm and how it works. I realize that with Helm version 3, the move away from the killer concept is definitely gaining traction, although it's not competing with Kustomize and at least 5 different other solutions that I can see that are out and about. And even on top of that, Helm itself doesn't prescribe a specific method of how the releases happen themselves, just about how it's packaged and some of the additional hooks. So it's kind of a grab bag. I'm not sure that I would focus in on Helm as being the major problem itself. I think as the SIG group itself is concerned, the manifest and obviously the resulting objects are probably more important than how it's packaged up.
Have you had a chance to look at the alpha for Helm 3?
I have not, but I've been tracking what version 3 was supposed to achieve. The entire break from Tiller was probably the biggest single piece, along with the capabilities of it understanding role-based authentication, where the original model with Tiller did not do that very well. So I would need to bone up on that. I can't say I know enough about it to actually speak authoritatively.
Yeah. I actually gave it a try just yesterday, and yeah, it works. There's a few, well, it's definitely alpha in terms of like even just like CLI parameters that are still there but do absolutely nothing, and the only way to like set the namespace, you pretty much need to set it in your kubeconfig, and then it will follow that and just ignore the namespace parameter and things like that. So it's definitely not ready for production, but these are more like cosmetic changes or cosmetic stuff in terms of how you interact with the CLI. Otherwise, it seems to work. But it's not something that you can just use Helm 2 and Helm 3 in parallel, because they have different ways of working. And yeah, you don't get to see any of your Helm 2 releases with Helm 3 and vice versa. So that also makes it a little bit difficult to just try it out progressively. So it pretty much you need to try it out separately, and then at some point when your confidence is good, pretty much replace everything.
I know on our team we have a love-hate relationship with Helm. When it works, it's amazing. When it doesn't work, it's very difficult to debug. It's very difficult to understand what's going on. And then suddenly I have an engineering team complaining about why are we using Helm as a templating language. So I'm curious if anybody has any insight as to if those types of concerns are being addressed in Helm 3. I know that generally the consensus is, everybody's waiting for Helm 3 to come out because it's going to solve these problems. I'm just curious if anybody has any additional insight there.
I mean, we've definitely had a lot of, well, Helm and just it's nothing related to Helm directly. It's just like using, well, YAML is not a very nice language. And then templating inside of that, it just like, it makes some of the ugliest code that I've ever seen. We kind of managed that. There's, well, Helm has a built-in test tool, which in my opinion is pretty much useless. And we have had actually some really good success with the unit test plugin. So pretty much it generates your templates, and then you can run specific queries. And that's actually been working really nicely in terms of catching things, indentation issues, and so on. Yeah, I see that Helm unit test. Yes, that's one. And it's been helping, so it hurts less. But yeah, I guess I'm really looking forward to the support. I'm not sure if it's actually planned or if it's just an idea at this point, but the possibility to actually work on object structures rather than just markup, that would be really nice.
Cool.
I'll add a couple tidbits here. I've been using Helm extensively for a long time, and came from Deus, who created Helm 2, and worked pretty closely with the people working on Helm 3. I will say that at least the way that I use Helm 2, I basically don't use Tiller already. It's not difficult to use Helm 2 without touching Tiller in any way, shape, or form. There's a couple different ways to approach that. You can either just use Helm template directly and pipe that straight to kubectl, or if you're writing your own CLI, it's really simple to just import the Tiller libraries and call them directly, so that you're not actually using gRPC to a Tiller server. You're just executing the same code that Tiller would have executed. And I've definitely had fairly good success with that method. I will say that all this, the difficulty of debugging some of the errors you get back is definitely a challenge. But I think that in the end, if you have a bunch of raw manifests that have some YAML indentation problem and you go to pipe that to kubectl, you're going to get the same obscure sort of error. So I think that to some degree, it's the errors that Helm spits back are not that much different than what the Kube API would spit back. So anyway, it's definitely a challenge, and I've had pretty good success with this Helm unit test library as well. It stops a lot of the one thing that it's caught the most for me is just essentially nil pointer errors that way down in a values file or something, that this plugin just instantly catches all those problems. So I definitely do like that. But yeah, I think that the switch to Helm 3 is definitely good, and there's not, depending on how you're using Helm 2 today, it's not that big of a feat to switch to 3. But yes, it absolutely is still alpha, so careful.
Cool. Well, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I'm not quite sure where we stand officially with Helm, to be honest. I know that as a result of some of those deep debugging issues that you touched on, Matt, I know that we kind of isolated it to very specific functionality that was very easily manageable. And I don't know if we're going to be looking at it going forward, specifically because of the work that we've done to not use it. So it's interesting. I'm really curious to see where Helm goes over the next 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think a really good operator, it could work. It's better to not use Helm, right? Because I mean, an operator it's better to import the libraries directly and use client Go directly and not have to ever go to YAML and have it do its processing. So I think that's definitely a smart decision. I think Helm makes sense for some things. It makes sense for sharing some best practices about how random people can install something like Drupal on a Kubernetes cluster. But it does add a lot of complexity that I don't think you necessarily need if you're going the straight operator route.
Cool.
It seems like from looking at different plans, we haven't used any of those operators, but like the Elasticsearch operator or the MySQL operator, it seems like it makes a lot more sense to use one of those operators rather than Helm subcharts. At the same time, we see that, like for us especially, we have a project that have some Node.js, some React that also have some server-side rendering. We have we use Elasticsearch quite a bit, so we often have those kind of projects that have multiple different components, and I'm not sure that it would make sense to have one operator that does all these things, putting them together. And it seems like Helm could actually be quite good at having managing this kind of setup where you have multiple things that are running. They're in a way they're kind of different microservices. I'm not sure Drupal as a microservice. It always sounds weird, but yeah. So it's I think there's probably a space for both. But yeah, I agree that at the moment there's too much that's being done with Helm that doesn't need to be done with it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because that's almost exactly how I extensively use Helm is so we have a bunch of operators running on the cluster, but then essentially use Helm to just create the CRD instance itself, and package up a few of those things that are needed for the app, and then the operators go and do their thing. So it's interesting. I think there is a balance that can work, and it's not necessarily one or the other. That somehow you still have to go create those CRs, and I think that it's not a bad way to do it. They need to be parameterized. You need different variables, whatever. It's like some of the things that Helm provides are useful for that. But I do think that it can be overused, and you don't get any value from that extra use.
Cool. Well, one of the things that we have on the agenda coming out of this is basically starting to talk about, how do we want to organize this group? How do we want to centralize our efforts, and what do we want to do, essentially? It's kind of been floated over the past couple of meetings, and I know that there's a fair amount of interest, but I don't know that we've actually targeted anything to do or devised a way to come together as a working group. So I just modeled what was happening in the Kubernetes world as far as the SIGs are concerned to get this started. And I'm definitely interested in people's ideas about how we can move this forward. So throwing that out to the group if anybody has any ideas.
Yeah, I mean, is the goal essentially to just come up with a perfect operator? Or what do you think the goal is?
Well, so we've got a host of operators that we're in the process of polishing up and are going to open source. So I think that what I would like to see as far as a goal is a common set of operators for Drupal, and maybe done in a way that is community specific. So for me, what that means is that if we can show the Drupal community a good way of implementing an operator for Drupal, then we could also potentially show the WordPress community a similar pattern, the Typo3 community a similar pattern, other CMSs, other projects, a similar pattern to be able to participate in. And I think that what's ended up happening, what we'll achieve as a result of doing that is saving people a lot of money and a lot of stress and a lot of time. Because what we've had to learn as a result of everything that we've gone through, they haven't been easy lessons. And if we can bring that back to the community, let people play more with Kubernetes and understand it more, then I think we're doing a good service. So short of any ideas, I guess I'll just throw a couple of them out there. I was kind of thinking that, you know, we've got a couple of issues that we've prioritized, or at least that have been thrown out there. Maybe we can start really focusing in on those issues, maybe a Slack poll to determine the value of them, and then start dedicating resources to actually fixing those issues and looking into them. To me, that seems like the most logical place to start, but I definitely am looking for input from everybody else as well. Cool.
Yeah, I guess some of the, well, I guess some of the Drupal specific issues, so things that are really in the Drupal code base, that's the one place where we could probably like agree that, yeah, these really need to be fixed. At the same time, it's the kind of things that like it's really deep into the Drupal way of doing things and so on. And I could imagine those those issues just gathering a few hundred comments and not getting anywhere. So that makes me a little bit hesitant on wanting to put too much effort into fixing those. So it's a bit of a tricky thing because we don't really know what amount of effort is involved on that side, and it's a lot easier to just fix things on the like Kubernetes side and just saying, hey, we'll work on the volumes because that's something that we can control.
And I may be a little uninformed here, but what are the general efforts in the PHP community? Maybe if our efforts were abstracted to be more of a PHP effort that would apply to multiple CMSs, maybe that could be of value to people. Does anybody have any insight there?
Not really.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think getting a little bit more structured about how we're approaching these and maybe raise the top 2 or 3 general issues that we're encountering. Right now, file system management seems to be the #1 thing coming up. Maybe we can start putting together a couple of issues. And I think that Brad Jones was very active in the BOF that we had at DrupalCon. So I think that he has some insight into some additional issues that we might want to look at and maybe work a little bit with Jeff Geerling to get some insight as to some of the problems they're experiencing on that side. Maybe by the next meeting, we can surface 2 or 3 issues that are worth at least talking about in the next meeting. And that might be a good next step.
Yeah, from the last meeting, I saw the video. Probably it was the first meeting, I guess. So from that, I got an idea that I could run some benchmark tests on some of the projects I have with the different file systems, clusterfs and NFS storage, and what else do you have? So I thought I could run some tests, benchmarking tests, send some 100,000 requests, and maybe publish the data so that others could also continue with that and publish their own data. In that way, probably we could at least get one grip on performance issues And other things, other issues which were mentioned in the first call were this file lock issues coming from NFS, I guess. So if you could figure out multiple issues from different storage, it would be helpful for others also to make a decision when they want to go for a storage system for their Kubernetes. I mean, in the Drupal community. So if that data is out there, it would be easier for others to take the decision.
I know I'd personally love to see some of those benchmarks.
Yeah. So I mean, it would be helpful if somebody could identify the existing problems and how to replicate them, so that others could collaborate and run some benchmark or write a benchmark script.
Okay. Cool. How about anybody else? Any other ideas?
Yeah, we've also done some benchmarks. Well, there was a while ago, but it turns out that mixing Helm and JMeter actually works out really nicely, so that you can just use Helm to create a bunch of releases at once and really test not like 100 requests or 100,000 requests on one environment, but really like having pretty much a full cluster. So that's yeah, I'm happy to point to that.
Yeah, that pointer will help.
Cool. So let's talk about action items for a little bit. It sounds like the first action item is going to be to create an issue to start talking about this. I think that, I don't know, my inclination is to create it on GitHub instead of on Drupal.org, but I'm curious what people think about that.
I would say it doesn't really matter, but GitHub seems like a good place to have these kind of things.
Cool, easy enough. I like small groups. We get consensus much easier this way. Sweet. So first action item for me is going to be to summarize this meeting, maybe provide a couple of links to the specific file issues that we've seen, list that Siva is going to start working on some benchmarking information for us, and then maybe use that as a discussion point to start taking this forward to the next level. The next meeting that we're going to have is going to be offset by 4 hours. It's going to happen 4 hours later in the day so that the folks in Australia and different parts of the world can participate. So by the time that meeting's in place, those issues should be up on GitHub and able to be referenced. And I expect that we'll be able to talk about them in Slack a bit more.
Yeah, another point I missed, it would also help if all the possible storage solutions are available. Like I could just recollect Glusterfs, NFS, and what was that, Rook or something. So if more such solutions are there, it would be easier for writing the benchmark.
Right. Right. And I know that we're going to get into some pretty interesting conversations once we start talking about the effects of different cloud providers too, and the differences between AWS and GKE, and it's going to be fun. So I'm looking forward to it.
Sure.
Cool. Can anybody else?
I mean, we've only been talking about file storage so far. What are your general thoughts about databases? Are you going to run them on Cube, or are you going to use managed providers, or how are you approaching that?
Right now, unless we have an on-prem installation, we're using the managed providers for simplicity and scale. It's been significantly easier across the board. Managing MySQL clusters inside of Kubernetes is a bit much when such easy services exist, you know? So I'm curious what other people are doing.
Yeah, we're pretty much for the production. Well, we're not in production yet, but the production-like environment that we have, it's pretty much using hosted services, and then pretty much using the database within the cluster for development environments and just anything that just needs to be disposable.
Cool. So can anybody think of any other action items or anything else that we should maybe put into this document for the other people that will watch this later?
Yeah, I got one question if somebody could answer. So we are planning to use Rundeck to perform these actions like taking a database snapshot, replacing a database. These are the general tasks we have with Drupal, right? Clearing cache or restoring the files. I mean, running remote drush commands. What would be the best solution to abstract it to the user so that they don't we need not give them the CLI access from the UI GUI itself. They could run those actions. So I think of Rundeck, but if anyone else can suggest a better solution.
So for CLI access, actually, as much as we'd like to not give users CLI access with standard Drupal development practices, it's really difficult not to do that and to and to keep your users. So pretty much what we've done, we actually have a container like that's running like next to the application that is running the same code base but with SSH, and we have a jump host so that pretty much you SSH into the jump host and then get forwarded to the actual container that gives you access to your code base and connects to the database, but it's not the actual container where the application is running. And we have some code in the jump host that pretty much checks the GitHub API for the public keys. So that's actually what it gives us authentication and authorization in one step. It's the GitHub API is not very fast, but it's actually really nice to say, well, for the developers, if you can push your code, then you can get access to the repository. And that saves us a lot of hassle in terms of managing access.
We went down a similar path. We started with a GitHub installable application with the assumption that we'd be able to realize more velocity as a result of offloading some of the authorization and RBAC controls to GitHub. That gives us the organization management, that lets the organizations manage their own users. There was a lot of upside to that argument. What we ended up finding out is that that doesn't translate very well to a larger system. So we needed to come back to something that gives us a central repository of our users so that we can be able to manage them through different scenarios. This is where we started evaluating things like Okta as an identity provider. We started looking at a lot of different solutions to be able to accomplish this. And I think that, well, I don't think, what we've done is we basically have Firebase, which is a Google product designed for mobile, doing all of the user management. So we have a centralized, globally available data store of users. And then that generates a token that's stored in the Kube API to associate back and forth between the two. And then we rely on Firebase specifically to manage those users for us. And then we pull RBAC controls internally. So what that gives us is the ability to work with different systems. So instead of just being GitHub and the concept of organizations and users as they apply to GitHub, we can now work with GitLab, we can work with Bitbucket, we can work with all of these different systems and allow them to interact with our hosting environment. So it's been a challenge, and it's not a solved problem. To this day, we're still, having very deep engineering conversations about what exactly RBAC means. What does it mean once you start talking federated Kubernetes? How do you keep everything in sync? How do you provide the proper access controls? Like I mentioned earlier, we basically stood up another API that genericized some of the kube functions so that we don't expose those to users. And they're interacting almost directly with the Kube API through that interface. So I think the real takeaway that we've learned is that the more that you can stay Kube native, the better off you're going to be with all of these things. And we've had to do some magic. We had to get into bootstrapping the Kube API to be able to get it work with the Firebase tokens properly. And I expect that we'll have a whole series of content out about that pretty soon.
Curious if anybody's done any investigation of breaking out of a container with PHP. I just worry so much about a multi-tenant Drupal setup because you're running code that you can't trust, and it's easy enough to break out of a container. And I definitely worry about this with this SSH sidecar that you were mentioning, Florian. Like that scares me a great deal if these are people that you don't trust. Just something to think about.
And this is actually one of the luxury that we have. We pretty much like have a setup where like anybody who has access is an employee. So
right. So you're lucky.
A good amount of trust. Yeah. This definitely would not work in as a commercial hosting provider.
Right.
Sean, did you have anything to add there? I know you pay attention to some of the security issues.
I mean, it's not an issue just with PHP, right? The breakout's an issue with any kind of shared hosting provider hosting communities. And I think Runc and a few other of the containerization libraries are definitely taking steps in the right direction. We're identifying issues and vulnerabilities as they come up, fixing them rapidly. We've definitely seen that already this year twice as far as I can recall. I think if we worry about that specifically in the context of this conversation, then you're not, we're not giving the issues that we can actually affect directly here the proper time and proper guidance. I do think it's a valid discussion. I'm not sure that PHP itself can do much in that regard, since we really have very limited access to memory and kernel level functions. Although, of course, anytime you're injecting things that can be run via the CLI, you have all that power anyway. So I'm not as much worried about the Drupal aspect or even the PHP aspect of this as much as I'm worried about the general container security. And I don't know if there's a good answer to that. I mean, there are definitely a few products out there that make this a little easier. Tools like Falco, for example, that watch for kernel calls. But again, it's not, I don't know if we have an answer for that yet. But at the same time, I'll go back to the cloud in general argument. When Amazon launched EC2, this was a valid concern for EC2 back then. I think we will get to the point to where it's solved to the point where everybody feels comfortable with it. I'm just not sure what that time frame is like.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I use Qubit, it's definitely multi-tenant, but it's running all trusted code, and so I'm just very interested in this problem of a multi-tenant Kubernetes cluster with untrusted users. It sounds like something that I wouldn't want to try to do today. That it doesn't seem like we're ready for it, but I don't know. It's a fun problem for sure.
And security is an ongoing conversation for us as well. And I know that we've been engaging with a lot of vendors and a lot of different products to try and help with the problem, but we haven't found a golden solution yet. And we're still in the process of evaluating our options there.
So that was helpful about the access and the organization level security and hierarchy. But I was also interested in the part where you run arbitrary tasks on containers. So I was kind of looking into that kind of solution.
Yeah, I mean, so it's tricky, but depending on what it is, like you can approach it with the same problem or the same sort of scenario as an operator, right? Like you can essentially have an action CRD or something like that that ends up that then the operator actually executes those actions, and that allows you to limit what can be done so that not anything and everything can be done, and you can validate and stuff like that. So that's probably how I would approach it, just so that it keeps it all. It keeps it all together, and then you can pump back statuses to that custom resource and stuff like that. So I don't know. There's lots of ways to solve these sorts of things, right? But my main thing is just not opening up anything and everything to be done, because then someone's going to exploit it.
Yeah, that helps.
Cool. Well, we're at time, so I do want to be respectful of everybody's day. Thank you very much for participating. We have a couple of action items that we're going to start focusing on. We'll post some follow-up information in the Slack channel. So again, thank you all for participating, and hopefully we can turn this into something amazing.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for running, Kevin.
Yep. Enjoy. Have a good day.
Thanks, Kevin. Have a good day.